Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kirk, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 16 wide receiver rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, we're covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses thus far this season, on average, have been giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers on a per-weekly basis from weeks 10 through 15, in order to give ourselves a little bit more perspective as to which of these matchups we have to take advantage of, and which we might want to avoid based on the cornerback coverage that will, of course, be up against our prospects. After we talk about matchups of the position, giving you guys the statistical rankings as such, we'll then transition into talking about our player rankings, top 36 at the wide receiver position, as I'll share with you guys my opinions and, of course, the statistics that justify the reasons as to why I have it ranked as such going into Week 16. Again, it's the fantasy playoffs. If you guys have made it this far, congratulations, but we got to keep going. Job's not done. And despite all the injuries and despite all of the inconsistencies of play, we're hopefully going to start our studs and get ourselves into a position where we can advance to our fantasy football championship. Now, speaking of a championship, for those of you who are new here, that's the entire goal of the channel. We're trying to help you win a 2022 fantasy football championship. So if you have not yet already, do yourself a favor, subscribe to the channel. We'll be making fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season, even into the NFL playoffs. So if you're interested, be sure to subscribe today. Thank you very much. Also, while you're down in the description, you can check out the timestamps. I have them down there for those of you who are looking for a specific player. Obviously, you don't want to, sit through the entire episode if you don't have everybody. So you want to go ahead, sift through the episode, look for a specific player. The timestamps are down there. While you're down there, be sure to click the like button and also check out PrizePicks. As of this current moment in time, they have a current promotion called the 12 Days of Pickmas going on today. You can go ahead, click the link down in the description, travel to PrizePicks, use promo code Andrew today when you sign up and make a first-time deposit. And that first-time deposit is immediately doubled up to $100. Go ahead and check that out today. Use the link. For those of you who are unfamiliar with PrizePicks, the entire point is picking more or less on given player statistics. So you can go ahead, pick more or less on fantasy points, receiving yards, passing yards, all of that, turnovers. There's so many different statistics, whether it's the NBA, the NFL, the NHL. You can check that out today. Link in the description. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about our Week 16 wide receiver rankings, but specifically, let's talk about how matchups have panned out over the course of the last couple weeks. Again, I have condensed it down over the course of weeks 10 through 15. I don't want to go ahead and talk about the full spectrum of the entire season, weeks 1 through 15, because it doesn't really give us a pure indication as to how these defenses have been playing as of late. When I have a prospect like Justin Jefferson going into a matchup against the New York Giants, he's not playing the New York Giants defense from weeks 1 and 2. He's playing against the New York Giants as of late. The injuries, the different positional swaps that we have seen over the course of the season, the inconsistencies of play that we've seen from that defenses as of late. So we want to go ahead and give ourselves more perspective on the matter. Therefore, as you can see to the right side of the screen, I've gone ahead and collected the statistics in terms of wide receiver receiving statistics in a half PPR scoring format and demonstrated as such. In terms of targets, receptions, receiving yards, and of course, receiving touchdowns, we find that the Tennessee Titans, followed by the Buffalo Bills and Minnesota Vikings, are giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers over the course of the last couple weeks now, week 10 through 15. Now, you obviously want to take advantage of said matchups, whether it is, guys like Chris Moore going up against the Tennessee Titans, the Buffalo Bills. Again, there's not really any Chicago Bears wide receivers that we can happily start and hope for an extreme upside. Maybe Darnell Mooney was healthy, we'd have a conversation, but unfortunately, he's on the injured reserve. The Minnesota Vikings, they'll have their hands full, even though the New York Giants wide receivers aren't as consistent as we would like them to be. I think Darius Slayton could very easily take advantage of said matchup if Daniel Jones wants to extend the ball down the field. The Detroit Lions, they've given up their fair share of points. DJ Moore should be able to benefit from that. But on the other end of the spectrum, despite some of these incredible matchups, which I'll go ahead and talk about more and more as we progress throughout today's video. On the other end, we have the teams like the Atlanta Falcons, who have played incredible in terms of their secondary play. Over the course of the last couple weeks now, they are literally only giving up 6.7 receptions per game to opposing wide receivers. It is quite ridiculous to see the statistics that they have only allowed over the course of the last couple weeks in comparison to some of these other defenses. Like, we expect the New York Jets to be one of the best secondaries in the league. Sauce Gardner's locking up everyone. Michael Carter in the slot position. They're playing extremely well as a secondary and as a defense in terms of coverage against opposing wide receivers. But a team like the Atlanta Falcons being in this conversation is very, surprising, especially considering where they were earlier in the season. And that's why we want to go ahead and isolate these statistics, because it does give us more perspective as to where these defenses have transitioned into, because you don't stay the same. You either improve or get worse. And that's the way that football works. So going into these upcoming weeks, hopefully these statistics help. All right, now that we've covered this, let's transition into talking about our top 36 wide receiver rankings for Week 16 of the 2022 fantasy football season. Again, these rankings are for a half PPR scoring format to meet everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard league or a full PPR league. For those of you who want updated rankings from Andrew, you can go ahead and check out the Patreon. There's a link down in the description, or you can go ahead and swing on by Sunday morning, Saturday morning. We'll be live streaming on both those days, even on Christmas Day. Yes, that is correct, in order to help you guys get your lineups ready to go, all that kind of stuff. So be sure to go ahead, click the bell notification button down below to make sure that you're notified when I am live streaming. Thank you very much. I'll have an announcement tomorrow on the quarterback and tight end rankings video. That'll be posted, of course, before the Thursday night game, but I'll have an announcement throughout that video that'll give you an exact time and date as to when I'll be live streaming this upcoming weekend. Thank you very much. All right, let's begin with our number one at the wide receiver position. We have Justin Jefferson. Again, you're going to start Justin Jefferson. That's a given. The only thing that I wanted to mention regarding Justin Jefferson is the fact that he has a really advantageous matchup going up against the New York Giants. Adoree Jackson has not played a single snap since week 11, since going out with his injury. If that is going to continue to be the case, there is so much upside for Justin Jefferson to continue his streak of success. As of this current moment in time, Justin Jefferson has 1,623 receiving yards in 14 games. He is currently on pace for breaking Calvin Johnson's record for most receiving yards in a given season. So with the potential of this matchup on hand, and the fact that Adoree Jackson's missing, and of course the New York Giants secondary has been shorthanded for the last couple weeks. I mean, we've talked about guys like Jahan Dotson, 105 receiving yards and a touchdown, 54 yards and a receiving touchdown in the last 2 games he played against them. McLaurin, 70 on 6 catches in one game. The other 8 catches, 105 and a touchdown. We've seen A.J. Brown go for 70 and a touchdown. DeVonta Smith, 64 and a touchdown. CeeDee Lamb went for over 100 receiving yards against the defense. And those are only just the last 4 weeks here in terms of matchups. I think Justin Jefferson, an absolute must play. Of course, you know that. But he's going to have himself an incredible performance and hopefully elevate you to the fantasy football championships. Moving on, let's talk about Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill has been absolutely ridiculous. In the 10 games this season that he has played with a fully healthy Tua, where Tua hasn't left the game early or been injured in any sort of capacity, he's been averaging 11 targets, 8 receptions, 111 receiving yards, and 0.8 touchdowns per game. That's a 20.00 fantasy point per game average in a half PPR scoring format in those 10 contests. Of course, Tyreek Hill takes on the Green Bay Packers this upcoming week. The fact of the matter is, all we can expect from Tyreek Hill is big performances, because that's really all we have seen. Like, over the course of the last 3 weeks, he has had himself 37 total targets, while in comparison, Jaylen Waddle has gotten himself 16. There is a complete difference in terms of overall opportunity, and Tyreek Hill being granted 10 plus targets per game on a consistent basis will continue to lead him to scoring more and more fantasy points every single week. This offense runs through him. He is their entire lifeblood at the current moment in time. So going forward, where he'll see Jaire Alexander, Rasul Douglas, again, nobody can really cover Tyreek Hill. They can only contain him for so long until he has himself a big play. All right, let's move on to our number 3, Davante Adams. Davante Adams in the last 2 weeks has put up a mere 16 targets, 7 receptions, 99 receiving yards, 0 touchdowns, and 13.4 fantasy points. Now, honestly, that scoreline should be for maybe 1 game, not 2 weeks combined. And hopefully, Derek Carr and, of course, Josh McDaniels are paying attention to the idea that, hey, our best receiver hasn't been getting the ball often, and we've been struggling in these last couple games. Maybe we should throw him the ball more. With the return of a Darren Waller and a Hunter Renfrow, of course, some of those targets are going to be, split up between these other receiving threats. That all being mentioned, they're still throwing the ball over 30 times per game. And the idea that Davante Adams isn't consistently getting 10 targets per game is ridiculous, much less 10 receptions per game, considering how talented he is at the wide receiver position. In my mind, going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers, who have most recently gotten torched by DJ Moore, 73 and a touchdown, Drake London, 6 catches for 95, Michael Pittman, 7 catches for 61 and a touchdown, even T. Higgins, 9 catches, 148. All these number 1 wide receivers have dominated against Pittsburgh. I absolutely believe that Davante Adams will be following suit this upcoming week and finally getting back on track with his performances. Moving on, let's talk about Stefon Diggs. Stefon Diggs has had himself back-to-back weeks of less than 10 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. That's the first time as a Buffalo Bill he has ever done that in his entire career. From 2020 through 2022, this is the first 2-week stretch in which he's had a back-to-back single-digit games. That being said, he did drop a touchdown, which unfortunately is the case. I mean, it happens. But he could have very easily gotten himself a pretty good performance this last week if, in fact, he had hauled that in. Obviously, he was dealing with trying to stay in bounds, trying to keep his feet in, all that kind of jazz. But either way, going forward, we're expecting Stefon Diggs to get back on track. Very seldom do we see him, put up inconsistent performances as such. As of this week, they take on the Chicago Bears. Most recently, the Chicago Bears have been torched by A.J. Brown, 9 catches, 181. In the same game, DeVonta Smith, 5 catches for 126. Garrett Wilson, 5 catches, 95, 2 touchdowns. Even Christian Watson scored 2 touchdowns in that game through the air, 48 yards and a touchdown. I'm expecting a big performance here from Stefon Diggs this week in order to help us elevate and get to the fantasy playoffs. Moving on to our number 5, we have Ja'Marr Chase. He takes on the New England Patriots. In 4 out of the last 5 games that Ja'Marr Chase has played, he's been able to score a minimum of 1 touchdown. I mean, that's pretty good statistics. So if he's continuing to get himself in the end zone, his baseline of performances are always going to be significantly higher than the rest of the field, especially the other receivers within his offense, despite the fact that even this last week, T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd both ended up in the end zone. The fact that the Cincinnati Bengals offense is finding their stride, especially late in the season, and are getting momentum, it continues to lead to Ja'Marr Chase scoring more and more points. Now, the thing that potentially gets him even further beyond his current upside is the potential of T. Higgins missing this upcoming week. He has already popped up on the injury report as of this week with a hamstring injury. And if that is going to be something that plagues T. Higgins going into this upcoming weekend's matchup, you got to remember, there have been multiple times this season, 2 different instances in which T. Higgins has been active and has not played in those games. There could be another one of those weeks. We're going to have to kind of monitor as we get the Friday's practice designation. But as of the last 2 seasons, when T. Higgins has been inactive and or active but not playing, we have seen 4 different instances of this scenario in which Ja'Marr Chase is averaging 15.8 fantasy points per game with 10 targets, 7 receptions, 78 receiving yards, and 0.75 receiving touchdowns per game. Pretty good potential if, in fact, T. Higgins is to miss some sort of time, but even if he doesn't, Ja'Marr Chase, of course, a top 5 player. Let's move on to CeeDee Lamb, our number 6. So there's a lot of conversation as to what is going on with the Philadelphia Eagles, but I want to focus primarily on what the potential of CeeDee Lamb is going up against this Philadelphia Eagles defense, because I know Jalen Hurts and that entire conversation does potentially, present merit in wanting to start all of our Dallas Cowboys, but let's talk about the coverage that he is going to potentially see. You got guys like James Bradberry and, of course, Darius Slayton, 2 of the best outside corners in terms of a duo in the National Football League. They really haven't been given up much to opposing wide receivers. So the question is, can CeeDee Lamb still find himself success in this upcoming weekend's matchup? I think so. Even with the potential of Avonte Maddox returning as a slot nickelback corner in this conversation, there is a lot of potential in which CeeDee Lamb is going to be utilized primarily in the slot position, and going up against Maddox is probably the most advantageous position that he can be in, considering the other cornerbacks within this offense. Primarily, I say this because Lamb this season has been able to accumulate 50% of his targets, 55% of his receptions, and 60% of his receiving yards total from the slot position. When he's running routes out of the slot position, he's an extremely deadly wide receiver, and in terms of fantasy production, he's going to get himself a little bit of a boost considering he'll be able to avoid guys like Slate and Bradberry and focus on Maddox for this upcoming week. I'm expecting CeeDee Lamb to be a great play. Let's move on. To our number 7, we have DK Metcalf, the thumbnail for today's episode. DK Metcalf will be without Tyler Lockett for at least 1 week. And with 1 week absence, there is going to be an increased amount of targets going in the direction of one DK Metcalf. Now, of course, let's talk about Metcalf. In the last 5 consecutive games, he's been able to get himself a minimum of 8 targets. It's a pretty good overall, contribution of opportunity. So if, in fact, you eliminate Tyler Lockett, who's getting himself very similar numbers in terms of the target game, and we start transitioning some of those in his direction, DK Metcalf should probably get himself at least 10 targets within this game. And the primary reason why I mention that is because this season in 2022, in the 5 games in which DK Metcalf has had himself 10 or more targets, he's been averaging 15.58 half PPR fantasy points per game and has put up a minimum of 14.5 fantasy points in those 5 contests. I'm expecting some big production this upcoming week, especially up against the Kansas City Chiefs secondary. Moving on, let's talk about Amon-Ra St. Brown. This upcoming week, he gets to avoid the coverage of the New York Jets, which of course is difficult, but now he has to take on the Carolina Panthers, which in my mind is a far easier overall matchup that we could take advantage of. Now, this being said, a couple stats that I wanted to mention in regards to Amon-Ra St. Brown. Since returning from his injury in week 8, he has had himself 8 consecutive performances of 8 or more targets. Now, out of those 8 performances, the last 6 consecutive games, he has had himself 70 or more total yards and 10 or more fantasy points in every single one of those contests. He's an extremely consistent wide receiver option, and especially considering they're taking on Carolina, this should be an automatic play for Amon-Ra St. Brown. Let's move on to the next player. It is Chris Godwin, another slot receiver that is obviously going to be dominating this week. He takes on the Arizona Cardinals. The Arizona Cardinals have not had the services of Byron Murphy, their primary nickel back, in quite some time. In fact, he hasn't played since week 9 due to a back injury, and it does not look like he's coming back anytime soon. Therefore, we're in a situation where Chris Godwin, who's coming off of another incredible performance, in fact, has scored 3 touchdowns in his last 5 games, and he's continuing to get himself, since week 6, 8+ targets in every single game, joins guys like DK Metcalf and Amon-Ra St. Brown in terms of steady target opportunity. Again, like we talk about, in order to score more fantasy points, you got to have more opportunities, you got to get more touches. And the fact of the matter is, these 3 guys are dominating in that current capacity. And going into this upcoming weekend's game with an advantageous matchup against a backup cornerback, Chris Godwin should be a fantastic play. Moving on to Keenan Allen, another slot wide receiver that we wanted to mention. All right, Keenan Allen is taking on the Indianapolis Colts. Their primary slot nickel cornerback, Kenny Moore, he is going to be missing. Therefore, he's going up against a backup, which typically they move their safety, Blackman, and they move him into the slot position in terms of covering slot wide receivers as the nickel back. And to be honest, he hasn't performed great this season. I'm expecting Keenan Allen to be able to cut him up a little bit in the receiving game. Of course, we've seen 4 consecutive games from Keenan Allen thus far this season where he's put up 12.5 or more fantasy points. He's been able to get himself 20 receptions in just the last 2 games alone. I'm expecting him to have another great performance here against the Indianapolis Colts, especially considering the fact that the outside wide receiver play of a Josh Palmer and Mike Williams will be slowed down, by guys like Isaiah Rodgers and Stephon Gilmore, which will make it difficult. But the running game, Keenan Allen should be able to succeed mightily this week. Moving on to A.J. Brown at number 11. Now, even with all the rumors as to what we're going to potentially see from the Eagles offense this week, we know that for sure there was an injury designation to Jalen Hurts today, and he did not participate in practice. That doesn't mean he's not going to play. My expectation is they'll probably want to play it safe with Jalen Hurts, especially if he is not looking great on Friday, but we'll have to wait and see. Either way, even if my assumption is that Jalen Hurts doesn't play, I think even with Gardner Minshew, A.J. Brown is a top 12 wide receiver option going into the given week. Let's not forget, Gardner Minshew has been a good quarterback throughout his career. Yes, he hasn't been the best decision maker, but in 9 out of his last 11 games that he has played as a starting quarterback of a team, he's been able to throw for 2 or more touchdowns. He's gotten himself in a great position, some of those being with the Eagles and, of course, some prior with the Jacksonville Jaguars. But either way, I think there's a lot of potential for A.J. Brown, who most recently against the Dallas Cowboys in Week 6 had 5 catches for 67 yards and a receiving touchdown for 15.2 half PPR fantasy points. With Minshew in the lineup, of course, funnel targeting guys like a Dallas Goedert and or an A.J. Brown, there should be upside. It's not going to be as much upside if, in fact, Jalen Hurts was going to be active, but I still think that Gardner Minshew is a serviceable enough quarterback to get A.J. Brown in a top 12 capacity. Moving on to Jaylen Waddle, our number 12. Jaylen Waddle has been extremely inconsistent, but we're at a point this season where we just have to play our studs, quite frankly. And this upcoming week, they do take on the Green Bay Packers. And when everyone's trying to bottle up one Tyreek Hill, hopefully the targets are going to start funneling back in the direction of Jaylen Waddle. Like I mentioned when I was talking about Tyreek Hill earlier, in the last 3 games alone, Tyreek Hill has seen 37 targets while Jaylen Waddle has seen 16. That is not a distribution that I love, especially as a Jaylen Waddle manager in majority of scenarios. But going into this upcoming week, you got to start him. I mean, last week he had himself multiple occasions in which he should have been able to score an additional touchdown. One-on-one coverage with Tre'Davious White. Unfortunately, Tua is not able to lead the pass. Jaylen Waddle has to slow down, come back for the ball. He does make a reception on a 40-yard play. Great, fantastic. But should have been able to score a touchdown there. Later in the game, single high coverage for some reason by the Buffalo Bills. He gets behind a second line, and that single high coverage doesn't even recognize him on the field. He just burns everybody with his speed after making the catch. I think there's a lot of potential for Jaylen Waddle to be highly utilized, especially back at home in fair weather in Miami. Should be a pretty good week here on hand for Jaylen Waddle. Moving on, let's talk about T. Higgins. We mentioned him earlier. There is a potential where he does miss this week, but if he does not, he's an automatic start. In the last 3 consecutive starts for T. Higgins, he has scored a touchdown in each of those games minimum. There is so much potential for a wide receiver as such, especially in an offense that is playing as well as they have, going up against the New England Patriots. If in fact the Patriots want to stop what the Cincinnati Bengals do the best, that's stopping Jamar Chase. And if that's going to be the case, Joe Burrow is going to have to look to his number 2, which quite frankly for other teams would be a number 1. T. Higgins is a fantastic option, assuming he gets a full healthy practice designation by Friday. Let's move on to Garrett Wilson. Here's the thing about Garrett Wilson. Even with Zach Wilson at quarterback, I am not afraid of starting him as a wide receiver 2 option. He's coming off of a week where he had 9 targets, pretty good number, 4 receptions, not great. Obviously, the inaccuracy of, Zach Wilson is going to be making a huge difference there, but 98 receiving yards. 11.8 fantasy points. We'll take that in a half PPR scoring format. But a couple things that I wanted to mention. In the last 4 games that Zach Wilson has been the starting quarterback with Garrett Wilson, we have seen Garrett Wilson surpass 92 or more receiving yards in 3 of those 4 games. Pretty good overall number. In fact, averaging about 7 targets in those 4 games, which in my mind is a pretty safe number, which will probably be a little bit more accelerated, especially based on the matchup up against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Again, most recently, CeeDee Lamb, 126 and 7 catches. Noah Brown in that same game, 6 catches, 49, 2 touchdowns. Amon-Ra St. Brown, 11 catches, 114, 2 touchdowns. Chark, 5 for 98. Tony and MVS for the Kansas City Chiefs against the Jacksonville Jaguars were both able to score as well. Have themselves pretty good games of over 50 receiving yards. The whole question is whether or not Zach Wilson can elevate Garrett Wilson to another level. Zach Wilson has only ever had 1 career game throughout the last 2 years in which he's been able to surpass a 67% passing completion percentage. One career game that was earlier this season, but only once. There's not a lot of hope for Zach Wilson, but hopefully Garrett Wilson will be able to get himself an ample amount of targets, which will lead to his success. Moving on to DJ Moore at number 15. DJ Moore has had himself a couple good weeks here with Sam Darnold. Like I mentioned in prior weeks, but I'll go ahead and reiterate, as we've been able to add this year's examples into the overall conversation. In the last 12 games that we have seen Sam Darnold starting healthy and not leave early with DJ Moore, DJ Moore is averaging 12.34 half PPR fantasy points per game, which is 8.6 targets, 5.2 receptions, 70 receiving yards per game, and 0.42 receiving touchdowns per game. This upcoming week, they take on the Detroit Lions. The Detroit Lions are one of the best matchups at the given position, top 5. And the fact of the matter is, against opposing wide receivers, again, the New York Jets, 14 catches, 253 through the air with Zach Wilson, the quarterback. The week prior, Minnesota Vikings, 23 catches, 326 and 2 touchdowns just from their wide receivers alone. Jacksonville, 10 for 140. Buffalo, 18 for 211 and 2 touchdowns. I'm expecting a huge week here for DJ Moore. Absolute must start. Moving on. Let's talk about JuJu Smith-Schuster. So JuJu Smith-Schuster, like I've mentioned in weeks past, when he is playing for majority of the game, in fact, playing 80 or more % of the offensive snaps, he is getting himself enough opportunity to easily be a wide receiver 1 in a lot of scenarios. Probably in a full PPR wide receiver 1 based on his overall reception counts, but in a half PPR sits in this middle of the wide receiver 2 conversation. In the last 4 games that JuJu Smith-Schuster has played healthy, fully, and has played 80 or more % of the offensive snaps, he has been able to put up 19.8, 13.8, 17.9, and 11.8 fantasy points. Last 3 games consisting of 10, 9, and 10 receptions. An incredible volume of opportunity leading to his success. This upcoming week, they take on the Seattle Seahawks, and despite the fact that they have played extremely well, especially against outside wide receiver options, since week 7, they've only given up 1 performance of 70 or more receiving yards to an opposing wide receiver, and that was against Davante Adams. Outside of that, since week 7, this defense has been playing incredible on the outside from their cornerbacks. But with that being mentioned, when I go look at the next-gen stats and the specific target log and the reception log for JuJu Smith-Schuster and where he is getting these receptions and where he's running his routes out of, the only time he ever played on the outside last week and made a reception was on 5-yard outs. Everything else that he was able to produce was in the slot. Over the course of the last 4 games here, which he's been consistently and heavily involved, 80+% of the snaps, he's been running 37% of his routes out of the slot and 63% out wide. Hopefully, they're going to designate him to play in the slot a little bit more, just like last week, and get majority of his work there, because it does lead to a lot of success. And for fantasy purposes, helps us out a lot. Moving on to Christian Kirk on number 17. I do not like the matchup on Thursday night, especially considering it's a rain game potentially, and there's going to be a lot of wind. But they're going to have to throw the ball nonetheless. This being said, the reason why I wanted to mention Christian Kirk at this high of a capacity, especially when we have guys like Zay Jones in his own offense that has been outproducing him over the course of the last month, is the fact that Christian Kirk has still been consistent. I mean, last week, 92 yards on 6 catches, 10 targets. Pretty good overall week. But considering he plays majority of his overall snaps from the slot position, that is where we're going to probably find the most receiving work out of the Jacksonville Jaguars offense, considering Sauce Gardner is going to be locking up anybody who's on the outside, whether it's Zay Jones and or Marvin Jones Jr. Christian Kirk this season has produced 71% of his targets, 73% of his receptions, 75% of his receiving yards, and 57% of his touchdowns, along with 70% of his fantasy points, all from slot receiving statistics this year. A pretty good overall slot wide receiver who's continuing to dominate the position. Most recently, we've seen Amon-Ra St. Brown, 7 catches for 76 out of the slot against this defense. I'm hoping that Christian Kirk can follow suit on Thursday night. Moving on, let's talk about our number 18, DeAndre Hopkins. We had 100% word from head coach of the Arizona Cardinals that we are not going to see Colt McCoy play this week. With that being the case, we're going to see Trace McSorley at the quarterback position. This was something that I did not want to witness, but it is what it is. When I ended up watching this game back between the Denver Broncos and the Arizona Cardinals from Sunday, there was a lot of instances in which Trace McSorley, as soon as he came to the game, was heavily targeting, DeAndre Hopkins. In fact, I totaled it up. In regards to Colt McCoy targeting DeAndre Hopkins, 6 targets, 4 receptions, 32 yards prior to his concussion. And then Trace McSorley comes into the game, 6 targets, 4 receptions, 34 yards. Identical numbers from both quarterbacks in splitting the time. Now, hopefully, we're going to see a little bit more production from Trace McSorley, but we can't guarantee that, to be totally honest, because he hasn't played well and really hasn't ever started his entire career. So with that all being taken into account, we're hoping that we're going to see at least some semblance of DeAndre Hopkins where he's able to get himself 12 targets, 8 catches, 80 yards, and be a decent wide receiver 2 option. But that's going to be potentially a pipe dream, especially considering they're taking on Tampa Bay secondary. Fingers crossed that DeAndre Hopkins can get the job done, though. Let's move on to the second half of our wide receiver conversation. If, in fact, you've made it thus far, be sure to go ahead, subscribe to the channel, click the like button down below. It would be greatly appreciated. Let's talk about Christian Watson at number 19. I told myself, Andrew, you're going to have to be a little bit more conservative with, Christian Watson. Now, that even being said, he was really close. For those of you who watched that Monday night game, he was really close to scoring 2 different touchdowns, obviously on the same drive, but he very easily could have been, an upside player on Monday night. Unfortunately, on one of the plays in which they run a little bit of a play action boot, they run, Christian Watson across the formation, get him the ball in stride. He gets tackled short of the goal line. It is what it is. The following play, quite literally the next play, they get him in a scenario where Aaron Rodgers calls an audible, sends him the signal of rubbing his forearm, and he throws it in the direction of Christian Watson. He's not even looking. Christian Watson, if he's paying attention, if he's not as, in his own head, catches that ball, falls into the end zone, is able to put up, a pretty good performance of 12, probably 13 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format, and we get another consecutive weeks of a touchdown. The fact that there is a concerted effort to get him the ball on a consistent basis in order to find him in the end zone leads me to believe that they're going to continue to go ahead and send him the ball, especially going down to Miami in a far better weather condition game. And the fact that the game script against the LA Rams did not promote the fact that they needed to throw the ball in that game, considering they couldn't stop the run. We're going to be in a conversation with this week where Christian Watson, in my mind, probably surpasses the number 19 rank and is an even better fantasy play for the given week. Let's move on to number 20, Jerry Jeudy. Let's talk about a couple stats regarding Jerry Jeudy that I collected in the last couple of days. So, Russell Wilson's coming off the concussion protocol. That has already been designated by the head coach of the Denver Broncos. Courtland Sutton should also be returning, obviously dealing with a hamstring injury, and Jalen Ramsey should probably be covering him for the entirety of that game, which will open up Jerry Jeudy for a lot of potential success. Now let's talk about this. This season, Jerry Jeudy has been able to surpass 4 or more receptions in 7 of his 12 games. In those 7 games, he is averaging 15.54 fantasy points per game, a minimum of 53 receiving yards in those such 7 games, and has scored 6 receiving touchdowns in those 7 games. Of course, even if you take away the game in which Jerry Jeudy scored 3 receiving touchdowns with Russell Wilson and had himself an incredible performance, he's still averaging 13.25 fantasy points per game when he's getting 4 or more receptions. All you got to do is get him the ball in his direction. Over the course of the last 3 games that Russ has played with Jerry Jeudy, he's targeted him 20 times. I'm expecting a huge week here against the LA Rams. Moving on, let's talk about Terry McLaurin. Another one of these big plays. The fact of the matter is playing against the San Francisco 49ers is not easy, especially when your run game is nullified and then the pressure that is going to be on the back of Taylor Heinicke with his offensive line falling apart against the New York Giants. I can only imagine it falling apart going up against Nick Bosa. It's going to be very difficult to bottle him up. So with that being said, Terry McLaurin does have an incredible opportunity for success, but it's just a matter of whether or not they're going to be able to get him the ball at a consistent rate. I mean, we saw guys like, Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf both nullified last week because all the San Francisco 49ers have to do is stop the run as well as they have, don't give up any big plays, and just, tackle the ball. That's all you got to do. And that's what they've consistently done all season. And therefore, it's really tough to start Terry McLaurin with a potential for an upside touchdown game. We know that over the course of the season, when Taylor Heinicke's been the starting quarterback, we have seen Terry McLaurin average 12.46 fantasy points per game, 8 targets, 6 catches, 81 receiving yards, 0.25 receiving touchdowns per game. I'm expecting a good week here, but his overall baseline of production and even upside keeps him in the wide receiver 2 conversation. Let's move on to our number 22, Michael Pittman Jr. We got word this morning that, in fact, Nick Foles is going to be the starting quarterback of this team. Now, since week 10, since the Jeff Saturday era has taken over, the offensive coordinator being changed, we have seen Michael Pittman targeted 9 times per game, which has led to a 10.3 fantasy point per game average. Hopefully, we're going to continue to see him get more and more opportunities go in his direction with Nick Foles at the quarterback position, but it's going to be a little bit more difficult. I mean, Michael Pittman Jr. is going to another quarterback. This may quite literally be his 5th or 6th starting quarterback of his entire career. Michael Pittman Jr. has had to deal with a lot. And even though we have seen some success against the Los Angeles Chargers secondary from wide receivers like a Davante Adams, DeAndre Hopkins, Tyreek Hill, Michael Pittman Jr. is not in that conversation. He's more of in the conversation of a Brandon Aiyuk, who most recently in Week 10 had 6 catches for 84, which in my mind could be a pretty good game if in fact Michael Pittman Jr. is able to put up similar production. Let's move on to Mike Evans, our number 23. Mike Evans is a tough conversation because there are multiple opportunities in which he could have had red zone targets last week in which Brady looked elsewhere, to guys like Chris Godwin, to guys like Russell Gage, etc. But one of these times, of course, Mike Evans is going to score. We're in a situation here going up against the Arizona Cardinals, who have given up their fair share of points to opposing wide receivers, and as a defense will be on the field for a majority of the game, considering Trace McSorley we'll have them in a position where a lot of 3-and-outs are going to exist. If that's going to be the case, we hopefully find Mike Evans in the end zone. It's kind of in a position where you're either starting him blindly without any sort of conversation about it, or you're just avoiding him. There's one or the other. You have to flip the coin. You got to gamble one way or the other and understand that he could go for 20 on your bench or he goes for 5 in your starting lineup. Either way, we'll have to wait and see. Moving on to Mike Williams. I don't really love the matchup against Stephon Gilmore, Isaiah Rodgers. And because of the type of receiver that Mike Williams is, I do not believe that the matchup against these cornerbacks really help him in this circumstance. I think this is primarily going to be a game in which Austin Eckler and Keenan Allen are going to dominate. And maybe even we see some sprinkles of someone like Gerald Everett get himself, pretty heavy work in the receiving game. But I believe Mike Williams is going to be in a position where his overall upside isn't going to be able to be met unless he makes an incredible Moss play over a guy like Stephon Gilmore, unless we see some sort of broken coverage that allows him to score a big play. Let's move on to our number 25, Amari Cooper. Again, I got to start my studs. Amari Cooper had himself 6 targets, 4 receptions, 58 yards. Is he a stud with that kind of performance? Absolutely not. But going up against the New Orleans Saints secondary, guys like Taylor, Adebo, Roby, I do not believe these are cornerbacks that compare to what exactly the Baltimore Ravens were presenting last week. And with that, Amari Cooper has himself a lot of upside considering we haven't seen Marshawn Lattimore play since week 5 and most likely won't see him back this upcoming weekend. Therefore, Amari Cooper, with the weather concerns, with there being potential high wind game, if by the time we get to Friday, Saturday morning, specifically when we're live streaming, we may potentially opt away from him if the weather gets to a position to where we're not comfortable with it, especially considering the play of Deshaun Watson hasn't been great as of late. But out of the overall matches that we have seen in the last couple weeks for Amari Cooper, this is the best one considering the cornerback coverage going into the week. Moving on, let's talk about DeVonta Smith. DeVonta Smith, in the absence of Dallas Goedert from weeks 10 through 15 has been the number 10 overall wide receiver in fantasy and number 18 in terms of fantasy points per game average with 12.9 and a half PPR scoring format. Incredible production without Dallas Goedert in the lineup. Now, that being said, Dallas Goedert has been activated. He is returning. And now that you bring in a backup quarterback, it is going to be a brutal conversation as to whether or not DeVonta Smith, one, first and foremost, garner enough targets to be a relevant option, much less number 2, have a good enough quarterback under center to not only look at Dallas Goedert and A.J. Brown as his number 1 and 2 receiving options, but hopefully look at DeVonta Smith is someone he could throw the ball deep to and make a couple big plays here, especially going up against the Dallas Cowboys secondary that has obviously been struggling due to the injuries that they have faced. DeVonta Smith could have a big week here. It's just purely up to who's playing quarterback. Let's move on to our number 27. We have Zay Jones. Listen, I love Zay Jones. He's been playing out of his mind as of late. Just to give you some perspective, from weeks 10 through 15, he's the number 6 overall wide receiver in fantasy in terms of total points, and he's the number 6 overall wide receiver in half PPR in terms of fantasy points per game throughout that span of time with 17.0 fantasy points per game. The unfortunate nature of this week on Thursday night is, of course, the weather concerns and the fact that he takes on Sauce Gardner most likely. Sauce Gardner in the last 2 games has held DJ Chark to 1 catch, 7 yards, and Gabe Davis to 1 catch and 6 yards. There is a very real conversation here where we have to completely avoid Zay Jones based on the matchup and the weather not being in his favor. Let's move on to our number 28. We have Brandon Aiyuk. The fact that we haven't seen Brock Purdy target Brandon Aiyuk more is a little bit concerning. Even with the fact that we haven't seen Deebo Samuel in the lineup, it is concerning that he comes away last week with only 2 receptions on 4 targets and 19 receiving yards. I understand that the matchup against the Seattle Seahawks was not easy, especially for outside wide receivers. But I think going up against the Washington Commanders in this given week, we should see a little bit more utilization in terms of wide receivers on the outside. This matchup specifically permits it. Therefore, hopefully Brandon Aiyuk can step up to the task at hand, especially with Deebo out once again. Let's move on to Drake London, number 29. Drake London was relevant early, and now he's going to once again be relevant in fantasy at the back end of the season, and hopefully, for some of us, help our year. Again, with Desmond Ridder last week, Desmond Ridder had himself a total of 13 passing completions, 7 of them being in the direction of Drake London. I expect to see a lot more target opportunity in the direction in a more pass-friendly offense with Marcus Mariota being transitioned to now Desmond Ridder looking to his fellow rookie within the offense. Drake London should have himself a big game here. Even though the matchup against the Baltimore Ravens is not fantastic, I still expect him to be a pretty good play with the opportunity on hand. Let's move on to Diontae Johnson, at number 30. I wish Mitch Trubisky was starting once again. And the primary reason why I say that is because in the games this season where Mitch Trubisky has been the starting quarterback, Diontae Johnson has averaged 10 targets per game and 11.66 half PPR fantasy points per game. In the games in which Kenny Pickett has been the starting quarterback, we have only seen Diontae Johnson average 7.13 fantasy points per game and a half PPR, 8.7 targets per game. the numbers decline heavily, especially in the fantasy point per game total. Specifically because we haven't seen a guy like Kenny Pickett want to air it out. They do have the opportunity of doing so up against the Las Vegas Raiders this week, in which they could take advantage of it. It's just tough to see with the rookie quarterback, Diontae Johnson, being an automatic play. Hopefully, he gets enough targets to be a relevant play after the catch. Let's move on to our number 31. We have Donovan Peoples-Jones. Was able to find himself an ever-elusive touchdown to save his week. But if he doesn't score that touchdown, we're in a tough situation. They're going up against the New Orleans Saints, and in the same conversation that we had regarding Amari Cooper, the coverage that he's going to see, Taylor, Roby, Adebo, it doesn't matter who is going to cover him. This is an advantageous week in my mind. I'm expecting to see a solid performance of about 9 to 10 fantasy points out of someone like Donovan Peoples-Jones. As long as the targets continue to go in his direction, he continues to get a lot of specific targets down in the red zone, whether it's fade routes, whether it's overall opportunities in terms of running a delayed slant in order to find him in the end zone, just like this last week. Either way, as long as they can keep looking in his direction in the red zone, should be a fantastic player. Let's move on to Chris Moore, number 32, taking on the best matchup of the week, taking on the Tennessee Titans secondary. The Tennessee Titans have dealt with a lot of injuries in their secondary. Not only that, we have seen this secondary, even when they're healthy, give up a fair share of points because they stop the run better than just about anybody in the National Football League, and that forces offenses to have to pass because they find themselves in second and third and long situation. Therefore, Chris Moore, who's coming off of 2 consecutive weeks of pretty good target counts, in fact, totaling 20 total targets in the last 2 games, being in a situation here with Davis Mills and or Jeff Driscoll rotating to be a pretty relevant option as a wide receiver 3 play with upside. Moving on to Darius Slayton, number 33, another fantastic matchup going up against the Minnesota Vikings secondary. They're giving up 34.7 fantasy points per week since week 10 on a per game average. That in itself leads me to believe, even with the lack of production that we saw from guys like Paris Campbell, Alec Pierce, and even in some circumstances, Michael Pittman Jr. in a half PPR scoring format last week, that Darius Slayton, with opportunity, should be able to be a pretty decent play. In the last 5 games, averaging about 7 targets per game, should be in a pretty solid position to succeed against the Minnesota Vikings secondary. Moving on to Adam Thielen. Speaking of the Minnesota Vikings, Adam Thielen in 3 out of his last 4 games has scored a receiving touchdown. That is the Adam Thielen of old, the guy that scores himself over 10 fantasy points without any question. And going into this week's matchup against the New York Giants, will hopefully be able to do so because, like I mentioned earlier with Justin Jefferson, with Adoree Jackson out, you have to then pivot every single cornerback on your roster. Your number 2 becomes your number 1. Your 3 becomes your 2. There, so on and so forth. And with the fact of, KJ Osborne having such an explosive performance last week of 16 targets, 10 receptions, over 100 receiving yards, a great game. The coverage and or the film may be looking towards trying to stop KJ Osborne along with Justin Jefferson, and sneaky old Adam Thielen, the veteran, is going to find himself in the end zone once again. Let's move on to number 35, DJ Chark. Prior to the game against the New York Jets, he's put up 8.6, 12.3, and 18.4 fantasy points. Those are pretty good overall fantasy point weeks. I think he probably even surpasses the number 35 number, assuming the game script forces Goff to be able to air it out. If in fact the running game is solid enough to where they don't have to air it out, it could be a little bit sketchy of a play. But in my mind, I'm expecting Jared Goff to at least have himself 200 yards and 2 passing touchdowns. Hopefully one of them to Amon-Ra and the other to DJ Chark. Let's move on to the final option. We have Demarcus Robinson. I don't even know if Lamar Jackson is going to play. And if that's probably not going to be the case, then we'll pivot away from Demarcus Robinson. But the primary reason I wanted to mention him is because Devin Duvernay is going to the injured reserve. And outside of, Deshaun Jackson and, Prochet, really, Demarcus Robinson is the number 1 receiving option of this offense, even with Mark Andrews active, who has been relatively quiet as of late. So I understand the matchup against the Atlanta Falcons is extremely difficult, but if Lamar Jackson is back, Demarcus Robinson should be a pretty decent play in a top 36 capacity. All right, that's going to cover it for me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I do appreciate you guys coming out, supporting the channel with your viewership, clicking the like button, supporting via the Patreon, whether it's via signing up using promo code Andrew via PrizePicks. Again, do not forget, as of this current moment in time, they have the 12 Days of Pickmas. You can go ahead, put together some entries, picking more or less on given player statistics, whether that's for tomorrow's Thursday night football game, whether that's for Saturday's slate of games on Christmas Eve, or perhaps for the NBA, the NHL. Check that out today. Use promo code Andrew because your first-time deposit is immediately doubled when using the promo code up to $100. Thank you very much. Tomorrow, we'll talk about tight ends and quarterbacks. Until then, thank you, everybody, for watching, and I'll see you guys. Peace.